You're now listening to Sanity at the Movies, the Raiders Pictures Edition. I call it that, of course, because if you watch any documentary or anything with Steven Spielberg, he will say, the Raiders Pictures. We made the Raiders Pictures, which I think is adorable, because the rest of us call them the Indiana Jones movies or chronicles or whatever it is we call them. But he loves that Raiders of the Lost Ark, and he calls them pictures, which is an old-timey thing that I always enjoy when anyone says, we went to the pictures. That's just something that our society has basically lost. Your thoughts, Jake Menzel, pastor who's a master of archaeology?
I'm not sad that we lost that artifact. I don't feel special nostalgia for it.
You don't feel any special nostalgia for going to the pictures or seeing the latest Walt Disney picture or
not really
the new Scorsese picture?
Not really.
I do. But
good for you.
Yeah, we can be different.
Yeah.
So we are here. We should explain to people what we were doing. We actually just achieved Patreon status of a sort that allows us to do this.
Yeah, we hit our first goal.
First goal, yeah.
All our goals are structured around something we're calling the superhero's journey, which is our attempt to go through the evolution of the modern hero and the modern hero's journey and examine the way that has changed over the past 30, 40, 50, 60 years. Because we're going back to the 70s, so... And even further back in this week's episode especially. But see what that says about us and what the movies have been teaching us about what a hero is and what's heroic. And
and whatever society puts up on a pedestal, you can obviously tell a lot about us. That's what they think a hero is. Well,
yeah. So it's, on the one hand, it reflects us, and on the other hand, it's instructive and it is instructing us. And so we're going to examine that, and there's a whole lot to mine about that, but we're starting with Indiana Jones.
We're starting with Indiana Jones. And why are we starting with Indiana Jones? Well, number one, it was a really good first Patreon goal.
Yeah.
I'm not going to pretend like that's not a factor in the decision here.
Yeah, people love Indiana Jones, so it's exciting.
We're not just in it for the money, though.
Yeah, so, okay, we're calling it the superhero's journey, and we want to talk about the superhero.
Mm-hmm.
So all of the stuff that we talk about, with the exception of Indiana Jones, is superhero stuff.
Right.
But we needed a place to start and a place to provide context for our superheroes.
Kind of an anchor point for just what is... We're going to see different types and variations, so what is just like the prototypical kind of American hero?
So the typical American anti-hero is the context. And that goes all the way back to the 19th century dime store novels and things like that.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about that today.
Yeah, we'll talk about that today. And we see that basically being developed in the context of Westerns, especially when we hit the big screen.
Absolutely.
So John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, and we could have spent time and done, the line from Roy Rogers to John Wayne to Clint Eastwood if we wanted to.
Yeah, and maybe we'll double back someday or do some stuff behind the
Yeah, and I think that we probably should. And I know we'll end up talking about all of these guys and more in this episode, but Indiana Jones really represents
a culmination, if you will.
He is like the culmination, the quintessential embodiment of all of these American anti-hero types.
Right. If every British hero kind of led to James Bond, let's say, a certain type of
It doesn't matter
character.
if it's Jesse James, if it's Wyatt Earp, it doesn't matter if it's John Wayne or Roy Rogers.
Or Humphrey Bogart from Treasure of the Sierra Madre or Casablanca or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. We're on the same page with this. It is all leading to Indiana Jones.
Dr. Richard Kimball. Actually, I don't know. That's just off the top of my head. That's just another Harrison Ford character. I don't know whether he belongs in the lineage or not, folks.
Probably not.
Fugitives. Really good movie, though.
Yeah, it is a great movie. Yeah, so Indiana Jones allows us to talk about something really fun, exciting, and cool, and pulpy.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody in the lineage of Indiana Jones coming up to Indiana Jones, and really spend a lot of time talking about just the modern American anti-hero.
Right.
Because we're going to see in all of these movies, whether we're dealing with a straight arrow like Superman or somebody like Batman, or somebody who, when we get to the more world-weary types of the Marvel Cinematic Universe down the line, all of them come in a context shaped by these anti-heroes.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little like if you're going to talk about vampire, if we were doing a series on vampires and we were going to, do our episode on Interview with the Vampire or Twilight, like you got to start with Dracula. Like who's just somebody who's the archetype, somebody who just embodies all those qualities. And
what Dracula did was actually take a whole bunch of other ideas about vampires, whatever else is out there, and combine it into one really iconic,
potent,
character named Dracula. Who has an awesome name.
Yeah, it is.
You know who else has an awesome name?
Indiana Smith.
Well,
they were going to call him that.
Indiana Jones way cooler than Indiana Smith.
Yeah, one of those questions of history. If he had been called Indiana Smith, would we be like, Indiana Jones? That sounds weird. I'm glad they went with Smith.
And so you see all of these things pulled together in Indiana Jones, and he's got the fedora, he's got the silhouette with the sunset. They're going to play with all these types. He's going to look like the cowboy. He's going to ride a white horse.
For crying out loud. And fight the devil. I mean, he's fighting Hitler.
Yeah. And so...
hey, what's the embodiment of all evil? Oh, it's Hitler. Yeah, of course. I mean, like it doesn't get much more archetypical than that.
And so he's going to get to play with, Westerns, and he's going to get to play with World War II stuff. And because we don't have to make him a cowboy, because we can make him an archaeologist, we can make him a world traveler. We can pick him up and drop him into any number of different. We can put him in the jungle.
He can be a lot more cosmopolitan than, say, John Wayne. He can find himself in different environments and situations. Yeah, make him a more pliable hero than a cowboy. Actual cowboy.
He's going to have to don his tweed and go teach,
and then put on his white suit to hit the
casino,
the Obi-Wan bar, or whatever it's called at the Temple of Doom.
He's got that, needs that white tux. He's got to be able to jump in and out of any number of identities. Put on his turban and blend in with the workers down in Cairo.
Yep. Yeah, he's just
punch out a Nazi and fit awkwardly into his.
Oh man,
what a great moment!
What a great moment! Well, what a great movie! What a great movie what a great movie where that moment doesn't even rate among its top 50 moments. That's just a throwaway.
It is probably, all things considered, my favorite movie.
Well, before we get into context, the larger context, and trace the hero's journey to Indiana Jones, which is what we're going to do today in this episode, we should talk about that. We should talk about the feelings that we bring to Indiana Jones. This was the first, I remember watching Last Crusade and Raiders. We weren't allowed to watch Temple as kids because it was too graphically violent. It certainly did have the mystique of that, though. I remember on the playground, I can picture the slide, I can picture the playground, and I can picture the kid saying, "Have you heard about what happens in Temple of Doom? The guy's heart gets ripped out. It's cool. You have to see that one." Oh, well, I'm only allowed to watch the other two,
Yeah.
But Last Crusade and Raiders of the Lost Ark, I mean, I was just a dumb kid. So I think at the time, particularly Last Crusade, actually, because it's such a kid-friendly, fun movie, those were the most exciting movies that I'd ever seen.
Last Crusade, the Indiana Jones movies, the Back to the Future movies, and then Goonies and Top Gun.
Yeah, and for me, the original Star Wars trilogy.
The Star Wars was in there, but not special for me, like these were. But 100%. Those were the movies that really shaped and defined my childhood.
Yeah.
Outside of the Disney canon.
Yeah, it was.
Which is just a separate question.
Yeah, I mean, the hierarchy for me would have been if you're a little kid, if you're under 6, then your favorite movies probably are Disney movies. But, once you get to be 7, 8, 9, 10, then of course it's Star Wars, and Star Wars is your entry point into Indiana Jones, which is who is obviously the coolest of them all, the darkest, the most scary and adult feeling, but also the most fun. Yeah. I mean, Indiana Jones was just, I probably, the fact that we're doing this podcast at all, the fact that I love movies, the fact that I've invested so much of my ill-gotten youth in movies was chasing the high of Indiana Jones and never really getting it.
What can live up to that?
What lives up to that? I think in the last decade, Mad Max Fury Road probably came kind of close for me.
Yeah, but the problem with Mad Max Fury Road is you don't have a hero that you can identify with on the level of Indy.
Yeah. If Mad Max had an actual likable protagonist, I mean, I like Furiosa okay as far as feminist
I'm not saying that
go, but
it's bad. It just the real comparison point, though, is the action. If you could take your affinity for, say, Tony Stark, which took 10 years and a jillion movies to develop, and place him in such a well-constructed action Rube Goldberg machine as Mad Max Fury Road,
then you'd
have something approximating Raiders of the Lost Ark. But you'd also need to add some real mystique to it, because that's the third element.
Yeah, the
in Raiders that you're not going to get is that vibe that you get when you get down into the Well of Souls and John Williams pulls an ace out of his sleeve.
Well, I mean, it's a religious feeling. There's no other word for it. Raiders of the Lost Ark manages to play with religious iconography, and so does Last Crusade.
Real potent religious iconography.
In a way that feels, now, I don't want to overstate my case here. I think you can make a pretty good argument that you shouldn't do what they did. And we actually talked about that in our other Raiders of the Lost Ark kind of proto review that we did on the Sound of Sanity show before the amoeba had split, that you can listen to. But what they do does at least acknowledge the potency of those things in a way that feels somewhat respectful, that feels... This is serious stuff.
This is serious. This is heavy. This is otherly. This is not the kind of religious stuff that you handle lightly. And the mistake of the Nazis is that they're going to handle it lightly, and it's heavy.
Yeah, and they
scary.
are going to pay. And it's just, I don't know. It does religion better than, say, The Shack, better than, say, God is not dead, better than, I mean, we have some genuine power here. Whether I like it or not, you can't argue that it doesn't give these movies some of their potency.
Yeah.
And one of the problems with the two bastard children of the Indiana Jones franchise, the Temple of Doom and the fourth
Kingdom of the Crystal
Skull, is their MacGuffins just...
They can't bear the weight of the Grail or the Ark.
Yeah. I mean, the Holy Grail is like, literally, the Holy Grail is the Holy Grail of Holy Grails. Yeah. it's great. And The Lost Ark, oh man, what a perfect conceit for a movie.
It's pretty cool.
I guess we'll talk about it some more when we actually do our long form review of Raiders of the Lost Ark. But man, it really makes you understand the potency of a good MacGuffin, J.J. Abrams. You can't just be like, well, it's the thing. It's the Wayfinder. We need it. It's really important.
It's a glow stick in the middle of a city.
No, give it some lore that actually makes it feel important.
Yeah.
And it can really dial your movie up.
Yeah. And, the smart thing about, hey, if you've got an archaeologist, you can play with lore that's real.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
It's sort of, in some ways, in an inverse way, what J.K. Rowling did. She didn't have to invent a bunch of lore.
Yeah.
She could just co-opt the occult.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And they managed to just co-op real religion. I mean, for lack of a better word. And again, I'm sure we'll talk more about...
Notwithstanding some serious details.
Yeah. I don't actually believe that there was a Holy Grail. That's not what I mean. But the way that they construct it, the idea of the penitent man shall pass, the idea of Christ was a humble carpenter, so if there was a Grail, it would look like this. And just the idea of you don't mess with this stuff.
Yeah. You will die.
Yeah. All has real power to it and real meaning to it. I mean, it really is lightning in a bottle. Like, I watch so many action movies and I'm just like, and I feel the pain of the filmmakers, because it's like you're going to have big action scene after big action scene, and then you have to have a third act with a climax. And guess what your third act with your climax is going to be? It's going to be in another action scene. But if you're a great action movie, you've already done your great action scene at the beginning, and then you've done your great action scene somewhere about 2/3 of the way through, and then you're going to do another one. Like Raiders of the Lost Ark and Last Crusade solved that problem beautifully by not actually having an action scene, but having something else.
A cathartic horror judgment scene.
Yeah, a cathartic horror judgment scene, which puts all the action in a context that makes it feel much more special than it would if Indiana Jones just had to have a sword fight with Hitler at the end or something like that.
If only, he could cut through the rope bridge. And
Yeah, well, that's the counterexample. And so I guess we're talking about our feelings, and what's coming out is that we both really love Raiders of the Lost Ark. We have mixed feelings about Temple of Doom. I think Temple of Doom is going to be really fun to talk about.
It's going to be fun to talk about. But
I would argue it's the last time that those guys actually really wanted to make an Indiana Jones movie. I think that will be my argument. Last Crusade, I think George Lucas always wants to make Indiana Jones movies. He did the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. George Lucas just loves coming up with crazy ideas for stuff. Steven Spielberg, I think, burned his interest out with
Crusade.
I think with Temple of Doom.
I know that's what you're gonna, but
Crusade's
okay, we'll have to talk about it.
Yeah,
we'll have to talk it through.
To Crusade, to my mind, we will talk about it. My hot take, I think, and maybe you'll be able to argue me out of this if you want to, but I think Crusade is just the work of a master filmmaker who still has enough interest to make it really sing, and who found a nice father-son story to tell that really interested him, kind of on the margins. Whereas by the time you get to Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, it's clear that Spielberg has nothing more to say about this genre or about any of this stuff. And
yeah, he doesn't care.
I think he's good-natured about it. I think he'd like to do it and do it for the fans and do it for the people who love him and Indiana Jones. And I don't think he's being cynical, but I just don't think he still wants to make those kinds of movies, and that's fine. He can do whatever he wants. He's Steven Spielberg, crying out loud. If he hasn't given us enough entertainment.
Where is if you age up Indiana Jones to Harrison Ford's age, where in time is this next movie set?
So according to this thing on Google, like Wikipedia, I guess, Indiana Jones was born July 1st, 1899. So
we're in the 70s.
So yeah, we would actually be in the 70s. What a terrible time to have to set an Indiana Jones movie.
No, you need to age him up even more and at least get to the 80s. But I was wishing that we could have it in the 90s.
That's interesting.
The reason is because when these movies came out, they were playing with their own childhood nostalgia.
Mm-hmm.
They were playing with their own nostalgia for these Westerns and for these serial movies, these B adventures, these pulp things. And they were just like, what if we had all of those things that we thought were fun, but with our big budgets because we're awesome?
Yeah.
Okay, well, you've got to get to an era where people feel some nostalgia.
Yep. 80s is played out at this point.
Yeah, and so if we could jump to the 90s and do what, X-Files, or what would have been the sci-fi?
Yeah, I mean, X-Files was big. You would be in a sci-fi-ish kind of era then. The problem is the snake's already eating its own tail by the 90s, so actually the 90s is just redoing the 50s with alien invasion and
Men in Black.
The 80s actually is the era that people now, thanks to Amblin Entertainment, associate with mystical kind of Lovecraftian, Stranger Things.
Yeah.
So it would be easiest to play on the nostalgia that people have for the 80s if you wanted to find the last era where people kind of associate the supernatural with that era. But I don't know. I don't know what they need to do. It's hard to imagine Indiana Jones in the 60s. You know what they really need to do? I think the technology's there. They just need to make a Indiana Jones back when Harrison Ford was in his 40s movie.
Use a body double and use the aging technology.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'm not being an ageist here, but the things that make Indiana Jones fun are not the things that people in their 80s, no matter how well preserved, can do. We don't need to see a story about how moving it is to see Indiana Jones get old and have to make his peace with, that's just not what Indiana Jones is about. He's about having fun and going on adventures and stuff like that. I don't know what they're going to do. I don't know whether they're going to do. As much as they keep talking about it, Harrison Ford really is 77, and he really does look like an old man at this point. And I mean, he looked pretty stooped and aged in that cameo that he did for Rise of Skywalker. It's hard for me to imagine that guy.
He just did an action film, though. He just did Call of the Wild or something like that.
Yeah, he was in Call of the Wild, but yeah, I don't know how much action is in that or not. But yeah, I mean, if anybody can do it, it's Harrison Ford. I don't know. We'll be here to talk about it when it happens.
Yep.
Lord willing.
But today is not
that day. All right, so I am now going to trace the lineage of the All-American hero from the beginning of time. Well, not time, but the beginning of
American
American heroes all the way to Indiana Jones. So we have
starting with John Smith and Pocahontas. Now you know why we've
exactly. That's why we did Pocahontas. It all started with Mel Gibson, as so many great things did. He freed Scotland. He did all kinds of great stuff, that guy. The first thing that I want to do is I want to just very quickly make the case that not every culture's heroes are the same. We're talking about an American hero. And so it feels like it might be nice to just make the point that different cultures have different heroes.
It doesn't go without saying. And the easiest and maybe one of the most important things to say about this is, a point that you've probably heard or intuited or seen other people say many, many times. We don't see a sacrificial hero in the world until Christendom.
Right.
Until after Jesus comes and is the sacrificial lamb who saves the world through his death and resurrection.
We see conquerors like Achilles, and we see tricksters like Odysseus.
And that's basically it, right?
Yeah.
But then, so the West is reshaped by Christendom and a new understanding of what an awesome hero is.
So you have heroes. I mean, where to even start? I mean, we don't have time or space here to cover
go all the way back.
But let me just give one example of one culture and the type of heroes that I think they tend to produce. And that is one that's very close to our culture, British culture.
Mm-hmm.
British culture tends to produce heroes who are... Now, you're going to be able to think of lots of exceptions to this rule. It's not a hard and fast rule. I'm just making some general observations here, so take them for what they're worth. But if you think about the iconic British heroes, if you Google iconic British fictional heroes, you are going to get people who, one way or another, work within an institution. They're not as individualized as American heroes. And so you even think about somebody like Robin Hood, the famous Prince of Thieves, right? He's an outlaw. But Robin Hood, in all of his original versions, was working actively. He was a nobleman. He was part of the ruling class, and he was working actively to get Richard back in power. Like, Robin Hood's not one of the 99%. He's one of the 1%. He's an aristocrat.
Yep.
Yeah, he gets to kind of have his cake and eat it too. He gets to hang out with his merry men and act like an outlaw. But ultimately, the story culminates with justice and order being restored and Robin Hood being a happy part of that. I think what I'd almost like to generalize about a British hero is that he is kind of like outsider insider. Like, he's someone that has to exist within an institution, but also has to make some space.
Of an outsider's perspective.
Yeah, have something of an outsider. So that would be Robin Hood. You think about Sir Lancelot, if you want to stick with that era. He's somebody he is the great knight. He is the great example of chivalry. He's also someone who can't actually quite make his peace with Camelot. He's going to sleep with Queen Guinevere. He's going to get in all kind of trouble. He's going to almost bring down the kingdom, earn King Arthur's wrath. But then when Mordred comes after King Arthur, Lancelot's right there. He's a team player. He's not, what we're going to get to, one of these individualized American anti-heroes who actually is in it to do his own thing. He's flawed. He's compromised. He's an outsider. He can't quite make his peace with Camelot, but ultimately he works for Camelot. Sherlock Holmes, same thing, especially in the original Doyle stories. Like, Sherlock Holmes is just happy to serve the crown, to serve people. He's not quite part of society. He's above it, but he's not actually the Benedict Cumberbatch version where he's completely antisocial, completely a jerk, completely, I think people, so the American...
They like to Americanize him.
Yeah, the American anti-hero has basically won in popular consciousness, so now every hero has to be somebody, like Sherlock Holmes is going to sneer at Lestrade, like the police could never get anything right. The original Sherlock Holmes doesn't sneer at Lestrade. He just happens to be better than him. Robert Downey Jr. sneers at Lestrade. Benedict Cumberbatch sneers at Lestrade. Like, these guys actively fight against the institution in a way, a very American kind of a way. The real Sherlock Holmes doesn't do that. Quintessential 20th century British hero is James Bond, and he's kind of got the same dynamic again. He's a company man. He works for the British government. You watch The Spy Who Loves Me, and he goes sailing off the cliff, and then the parachute opens up, and it's got the British flag on it, and it's a big applause moment. Like, James Bond has an uneasy, he's rebellious, he's sexually depraved, he has an uneasy relationship with his superiors, he's always making fun of Q and getting reprimanded by M, but ultimately, James Bond is on our team. He's one of the elites. He's one of the people that gets things done. Daniel Craig has, again, every time Daniel Craig makes another James Bond movie, James Bond goes off the reservation. He can't make his peace with being on the team. The real James Bond, as much of a thug and a sexual deviant as he was, could always make his peace with working for the crown.
Yeah. So you have these British heroes that they're all actually upper crust. Mm-hmm. They're all elite. They're all, you can trace the American anti-hero to this guy, mm-hmm. because he is sort of standing, he's within the system, but he's given the side eye to the system.
Yeah.
Right. And he's winking and
that's a lot of the fun of the old James Bond is like, yeah, I work for you, but really I just like sleeping around and shooting who I want. And
thank you for giving me a license to do this.
Yeah, exactly.
Because you give me a license to do this, I will honor you. You got my back, I got yours.
But also, when Britain had the Olympics, the opening of the Olympics had James Bond, as played by Daniel Craig, escort the Queen. Like it was part of the ceremony.
Yeah.
James Bond is, even in today's day and age, a symbol of British might, British power. I mean, you can look up all kinds of dumb, anti-colonialist papers and academic stuff about how awful James Bond is, and it's because they rightly see that he is associated with that class, even though he's uneasy with it, and that's a quality we're going to talk about. The last one that I thought of, I mean, if you type in British heroes, British fictional heroes, you're going to get Harry Potter. There again, that's in the British schoolboy tradition, which there were a lot of novels written like that in the early 20th century. And those novels are all about how great it is to go to school, find your place. And there's a little bit of a British Horatio Alger kind of thing. You come from nothing, but you're always striving to become part of the ruling class, and you're always happy to do it at the end. And yeah, he's got a weird insider-outsider thing going where he's partially outside of things, but also he ultimately exists to keep the establishment, to keep Hogwarts going, to go and work as an Auror. It doesn't matter how many things are corrupt or need to be stood against, and there are plenty of them. Ultimately, Harry's a team player.
Yeah. And so if you think about it in that sense, just in terms of the British mentality and the American mentality, well, the Brits always, looked askance at the crown and at everything else, and, but felt they're going to play within the system at a certain point.
Like
right?
It's our privilege to look askance to the crown because we also bow to it and serve it and protect it, and it protects us.
And at some point, these dirty Americans decided, well,
enough with that. and that is so.
You're outsiders on the inside, and we'll just be outsiders.
Right, and that is so fundamental to the American character, and obviously that's where I'm going with this. Americans are not quasi insider outsiders. They're just outsiders a lot of the time. Or if they're insiders, they're fundamentally outsiders. Like John Wayne can get his act together enough to save the girl from being raped by the Indians or whatever in The Searchers. But then he's not promoted to have institutional weight or authority or anything like that. He doesn't become part of the crowd, part of the system. He stands outside it, and it's one of the most potent and poignant moments in American cinema. I mean, it really is a defining moment in The Searchers. Like, this guy is fundamentally, at the end of the day,
he's outside the house.
He's outside the house. He might serve the interests of the house and of domestic life and of happiness and of society.
He's not part of it.
He's not part of it.
He's not able to be.
Because he's a rebel and he's an individual. And that is...
the very things that make him the hero that we need are the things that exclude him from partaking in the things that he's fighting to save and protect.
Right. We'll trace that lineage a little bit more in a minute. The only thing I was really doing with the British was saying, like, hey, here's a different culture, and it's pretty similar to ours, but it's a little different. And you could talk about Japanese culture or China, like the kind of people that they make heroes, completely different. right? But let's actually move forward for a moment and look at what constitutes an American hero a little bit more. And then we'll go back and we'll kind of trace how we got there. But I want to take you, Jake, to the 1930s when a bunch of quintessential and iconic and influential American heroes were born. So you've got Philip Marlowe in 1933, Raymond Chandler's famous private eye detective. You've got Superman. Action Comics #1 comes out in 1938. You've got John Wayne playing the Ringo Kid in Stagecoach, the movie that kind of made him a star and defined his persona. That's 1939. Same year, Detective Comics 27 comes out with Batman, March 1939. And then we'll go into the 40s. You've got Casablanca, 1942, still kind of a relic of the 1930s.
Detective Comics, by the way, for people who don't know.
Detective Comics DC?
DC.
Yeah, exactly. And it was just called Detective Comics, and it wasn't specifically about Batman, but then everybody was like, hey, we kind of like this Batman character. Maybe you should make him the guy, and then we'll give you more money. And they did.
Yep.
Which was probably a smart move. So you could argue that this era is the flowering of all these archetypes, right? And what you have here, I think, like what's different about all these guys in their way is if British people are outsidery insiders, they might be outsidery, but ultimately they're insiders. Now we're looking at insidery outsiders.
Yeah.
These people exist outside the system. They might serve it. They might be inside it enough.
They might have good contacts on the inside.
Yeah. But Philip Marlowe, he's not a cop. And all the guys in the pulp novels of that time weren't. Some of them were, but the ones that have really succeeded and thrived and that we remember were ones like Philip Marlowe, or like Sam Spade and the Maltese Falcon, or these guys who just did their own thing because the system was fundamentally broken and corrupt. And the only way that a good man could get anything done is by just doing his own thing. Like Philip Marlowe would love to be a cop, I think. Like Chandler makes him very Christ-like, especially in the later novels. Like he wants to save people. He wants to do the right thing, but he can't because the system is just bad. It's just broken. And so he has to exist outside of it, and it's painful. A Superman, very positive spin on the same kind of thing. Like he is the outsider of all outsiders. He's a space alien, and he chooses to ally himself with truth, justice, and the American way. We're always going to play with the tension of the fact that he is in fact just doing his own thing. I mean, he's Superman. It's in his name. Like he's beyond us. He wasn't elected to that position in some kind of a democratic process. He just showed up one day and said, hey, guess what? I'm Superman. You watch Stagecoach with John Wayne. He plays a criminal outlaw character who is on the run, out to serve his own interests. And it ends up being the noble guy. It's got the classic moment where he has a chance to escape custody. And then, the Indians are attacking and the woman is threatened and he decides to go back. But he's not a member of the system. And then, of course, Batman. I mean, I don't have to bore everyone by explaining who Batman is or how he exists outside of the system.
The quintessential vigilante.
And then Rick Blaine in Casablanca, same thing. Like he might join the resistance at the end, but he can't ever go back to America. We don't know what happened. Like to think that he killed a man. It's the romantic in me. But he is forever outside. That's who he is. He's not getting back in. The guy that is the inside, the guy that the British story would be about would be the freedom fighter guy, who's just the freedom fighter guy.
Yeah.
He's awesome.
Well, so, I mean, and that's another way to sort of delineate this is that at the end of the day, the American outsider is, after the fight, he's going to wipe blood from his face and dust the dust off his jacket. Our British hero he'll be annoyed if he got a little bit of dirt on his cuff.
Yeah.
He's clean.
I mean, it really is the difference. I mean, we're getting to Indiana Jones, but think about the difference between Indiana Jones and James Bond for a second. The whole joke
one of them gets beat up all the time, and the other one,
the other one adjusts his tie as things blow up around him.
Yeah, after he's been through a massive fist fight.
Mm-hmm. One of them falls asleep when the woman throws herself at him. Like he's so tired and beaten up that he can't actually claim his sexual reward. One of them has sexual rewards thrown at him on a daily basis and enjoys all of them to their fullest.
And is never somehow too tired or beat up or put out or
in any way stymied in his sexual content. I mean, it's the joke. I mean, that is the joke of Indiana Jones. That is the delicious adult irony, if those movies can be said to have any, is Indiana Jones always kind of fails at living up to who James Bond is. And then the awesome joke of Last Crusade is that they hired Sean Connery so that Indiana Jones could literally fail to live up to who James Bond is.
Yep.
I mean, it's really great.
Sean Connery in his best role ever.
Sean Connery at his absolute best. That's absolutely right. And we'll have a lot to say about that later. So in the 1930s, you have all these archetypical American outsider males, and you can just see the lineage of it after that. I mean, the Searchers we talked about. Clint Eastwood, I think, is worth talking 2 seconds about, because I think what Clint Eastwood did is stripped away the last pretense that we were actually interested in anything besides that. Like some of those other guys pay lip service to being company men or to doing the right thing, but the fun of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is, what if this guy really just was in it for himself, and that's it? We don't have to bore you with the parts of the plot where we justify why he's doing this. He's just doing it. Let's just cut out all the boring parts.
Let's remove the code.
Yeah, exactly. Same thing with Dirty Harry. Dirty Harry is interesting. I guess you could argue that he's part of the system because he works as a cop, but not really. Not in the same way that any of those British heroes were part of the system. Dirty Harry hates the system. What Dirty Harry likes is just shooting bad guys as he sees them, as he defines them. And he just happens to have found a job where he has some kind of an excuse, even though he's always in trouble and his supervisors don't like him. But those movies have so little to do with any kind of real police work, with any kind of real hierarchy within the police department. You know, Dirty Harry just exists to be the guy in a bar who has a giant gun that he can pull out when random hoodlums decide to harass a waitress. And he doesn't feed the part of us that enjoys law and order. He feeds the part of us that is annoyed with people and wishes we could just pull out our giant gun.
Wishes we had a license to kill.
A license to kill. Exactly. So that's kind of who the American hero is. He's individualistic and he's rebellious. I mean, do you have to say he doesn't exist to serve the needs of...
But he does have...
He's got a code.
He does have a code.
Mm-hmm.
And he's going to... His principal heroic trait is that he never gives up.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
He never says die.
Mm-hmm.
Goonies never say die, man.
Yeah.
And neither does Indiana Jones, and neither do any of these heroes. They don't stop coming. And we'll see that one trait. We'll trace that. That trait is not going away.
No.
That trait is going to be the thing that sticks, I predict, all the way through the very end of our superhero's journey.
Mm-hmm.
If there's one constant, it's that the real heroism is, it doesn't matter how many times you fall, you get back up and you keep coming.
Yeah.
That's the superpower.
Yeah. We're going to meet characters that are cowards, even like Guardians of the Galaxy guy. We're going to meet characters that vary a lot in the ways that they in their approaches to heroism. And we're going to see the way that people enjoy watching heroism change a lot in these movies. But yeah, I think there's two things you're going to see. Number one, they all exist somehow outside the system.
Yep.
The system is bad.
The system is bad. They're outsiders.
And number two, they don't give up.
And they more or less have some kind of code, and we'll watch and we'll get to the bottom of what those codes are and how they change.
Yeah, and that's going to be really interesting because I don't think that the change has been for the better.
Yeah, this is not the code of Arthurian knights.
No, it's sure not. It's one of the sick jokes about the Last Crusade. Whatever else Indiana Jones is, he doesn't really belong in the lineage of Sir Galahad, I don't think.
Yeah.
Sir Galahad, for one thing, was the Virgin Knight, and Indiana Jones certainly wasn't that, as that movie was at pains to remind us awkwardly over and over again.
Yep.
So, okay, why are Americans like this? Well, I don't know. John Locke, like
French Revolution.
the French Revolution.
American Revolution.
Like we actually...
The Taming of the Wild West.
It does have to do with our political philosophy, I think. All men are created equal and have certain inalienable rights. That comes out of a real philosophy. You can read John Locke if you didn't have the joy of doing that in high school and see him lay out a political moral philosophy for individual happiness. And America is the first semi-successful nation.
Real experiment
in that. And it does, philosophies matter, ideas matter. It defines our character. It makes us who we are. And our art exists to propagate certain things about that. I don't want to sound all Marxist about it or anything like that, like as if the only art we can make is art that has systemic biases. But without being too Marxist about it, of course, art has systemic biases. And of course, it exists to propagate certain values. And of course, those values align with the values of the people that make the art.
Yeah, and one way or another, it's going to be reflective of your God.
Yeah.
And your politics are going to be in line with your God. And when your God and your politics become one, that's called statism.
And who is the American God? I would argue the American God is... insofar as we believe he exists, he exists in a deistic system where he's kind of hands off, and what he wants is for us to be happy.
Yep.
Basically, that's not how the Greeks thought about that. That's not Odysseus's God, and that affects Odysseus's brand of heroism, or Achilles' brand of heroism.
Not hands off and not benevolent.
Not hands off, not benevolent. Exactly. If anything, hands on and malevolent.
That's right. Or at the very least, capricious.
Right. The other thing that you have to understand as you trace this lineage is I don't think you can overstate the importance of the mythology of the Old West. As I did some research for this, what I realized is that it's something that I never ever really knew until researching this. The mythology of the Old West, like when would you say, Jake, off the top of your head, the Old West began to be mythologized?
I almost want to say in real time.
That's exactly right. And that's what surprised me. The first dime store novel, the first novel about Indians versus cowboys and just like all those tropes came out it was called Maleska, the Indian Wife of the White Hunter, and it came out in June 8th, 1860, which for context, that's a year...
I was going to guess the 1860s.
That's a year before the Civil War.
Yep.
Like we're already telling this monomyth about our country and about the Wild West that we're taming. We're telling that to ourselves as it happens.
Yep.
Like most of the...
Manifest destiny, baby.
Yeah. And the... Like you watch a John Wayne movie or something like that, those are all set after the Civil War. Like,
oh yeah,
all the movies are set after the mythology was already pretty well established. And the people that you've heard of, people like Wild Bill Hickok and Buffalo Bill Cody, people like that, they were playing to the mythology. They knew the mythology. Right. And they would sit down with reporters and dime store novelists and tell their stories and make them larger than life and appear in rodeos. And, P.T. Barnum had a Wild West show. And this stuff was all happening in the 1860s, 1870s. That story, the lawless frontier, where good, quote unquote, guys have to make their own destiny and create their own law, make their way through the savages. You can't get away from that. Mm-hmm. Make their way through the Aboriginal savages and somehow carve out some little space of home for themselves. That story's been big business since
the 1860s.
Since the 1860s, yeah. Dime novels, they were crappy, cheap paperback editions, of popular fiction that began in the mid-1800s. Like I said, Maleska, the Indian Wife of the White Hunter by Anne S. Stevens came out in June 8th, 1860. It has all the tropes, cowboys, Indians, all that stuff. And it's just by some lady, like she's the wife of a printer or something. I don't think she knew anything about the Wild West. She just knew
She knew enough to romanticize it.
She knew how to romanticize it, exaggerate it, and make it into a good story. And then you have people like P.T. Barnum, and you have people like Buffalo Bill, who served in the Pony Express, served in the Civil War, was a civilian scout in the Indian Wars, and then made a living by exaggerating his stories and telling them to people and making a big deal out of it. And then he started doing his Wild West show, which had Annie Oakley, sharpshooting and all that stuff. And so I was trying to think of what we can compare it to. I mean, the obvious comparison right now as we record this, I guess, would maybe be Black Lives Matter, just insofar as when big social movements are happening, they need their heroes, they need their villains, and they need their mythology. And you can't really say what's going to stick while it's happening in real time, which is why it's hard to pick a current comparison point. But the point is, they definitely had to mythologize it. By the 20th century, the cowboy had really just become the dominant figure of American manhood. You go to like an antique store and you walk around and you see stuff from the early 20th century, and it's all cowboys and Indians and cigarette cases and cigar boxes and pipe tobacco and wooden Indians and little toys, and people just ate that stuff up. And you can really trace the lineage from that to Indiana Jones to everything we're going to be talking about directly, because the dime store novels became the pulp magazines. The pulp magazines of the early 20th century became radio shows, movie serials, and comic books. I mean, it's just one to one. Like, those things transformed into each other. As the pulp magazines died, comic books took their spot on the newsstands. And then finally, some fellas like George Lucas and Steven Spielberg were like, hey, we love all that. Let's give it a big budget and some A-list talent and make a cool big version of it. And, you could say the James Bond producers and people like that had already been doing it.
Or the John Wayne.
Or John Wayne, sure. I think what's important about Spielberg and Lucas, and I'm sure we'll talk about more of this, is kind of like I was saying about Clint Eastwood. They just cut out all the boring stuff. Mm-hmm. You watch a Humphrey Bogart movie and it's going to have cool action and stuff, but you're always going to have to sit through a plot. And the genius of George Lucas is like, well, I hated all that stuff when I was a kid. I was just there for the big action scene. Like, we have to sit through all this religious mumbo jumbo and Ben-Hur just to get to the chariot race. What if we made a movie that was just chariot races? Like, that'd be cool. And it was a good idea. Let's not pretend like we're here for anything but the chariot race. It's pretty smart. You do it wrong and you get Rise of Skywalker, where it's all chariot race and there's so little substance that it doesn't really feel like a movie or a story. But
what you should have done is made it all pod racing.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the lineage. That's the American hero. Let me talk a little bit about serials, because I feel like everyone's always like, Indiana Jones, it's just like those old Saturday matinee serials. But I've never seen a single frame of one of those things. I don't know if you have. I think like maybe if I watched an Indiana Jones documentary, they would show like 2 seconds of a guy jumping from a horse onto a truck, or, some scenes that looked similar. But, we all act like it's this cultural reference point, but it's only because Lucas and Spielberg have brainwashed us and told us it's a cultural reference point. For my generation, it's not a cultural reference point at all.
No, Indiana Jones is just the thing.
He's just the thing. But in the 1930s and 1940s, less successful studios and kind of independent studio, not your 20th Century Fox, but your Republic serials and people like that, they would make these short films, and the short films would be quickly, cheaply produced, and they'd be about a half an hour to 20 minutes, half an hour. Like, I think the first installment would usually be a half an hour, and it would set up the hero and the villains and the mission. And then after that, we'd do maybe 10 to 15, 20-minute installments, and they would end with literal cliffhangers.
To be continued.
And if you're a kid in the 30s, 40s, maybe into the 50s, you go to the theater for Saturday. Your parents drop you off, because we don't have helicopter parents, or they don't drop you off. They say, get on your stupid bike or pay your 2 bits to the trolley guy so you can go down, and you actually spend all day.
A nickel, I think, is what you needed to pay.
Yeah, I don't know where 2 bits comes from. That's probably British, right? Who had bits.
Yeah.
But you're going to
go to the Nickelodeon.
Go to the Nickelodeon, get some steak and kidney pie. You're going to see at least one animated cartoon. You're going to see a chapter of a serial like we were talking about. You might see a newsreel to show you all the current events, because it's not like they could just turn on CNN. And then you might see like 2 feature films. So it's like a half a day's entertainment, and people could kind of wander in and out. And, maybe, if you're a cool kid, you've already seen the movie, so you just wander in for the serial and watch that and watch your Bugs Bunny cartoon or whatever it is, and then leave. So that's what it is. And Spielberg and Lucas really liked that stuff. I mean, the thing to emphasize, I think about it, is that it was pretty cheaply produced and pretty transparently, what's the word? Like, not prurient exactly, but just trying to grab people's attention. Like, we're not making art here. You know, the names were things like famously Flash Gordon Conquers the Universe, which influenced another film franchise. The Phantom Creeps, The Green Archer. It's just all trashy, pulpy. You're not watching this for anything besides the thrills that it purports to give you.
Yep.
Flashy title, beautiful ladies, bad guys. And Jungle Adventure was definitely, you know, you had sci-fi stuff, you had detectives, you had a Batman and a Superman serial at one point or another as those characters became popular. But Jungle Adventure is one of those genres that's kind of always been chugging along. I don't know that it's ever been just taken off and had the kind of cultural dominance that the Old West has, but
it's also never really gone away.
Yeah, just people like those kinds of stories. I mean, Indiana Jones has his lineage.
The idea that there are still places in the world that things are hidden or haven't been uncovered, and
which is maybe the reason we don't have as many of those stories now, is because it's actually less easy to believe that exists in the day of Google Maps. It takes a little work, or it takes going to a different planet, which is why so many of the stories, I think, expand into...
Yeah, a lot of the Jungle Adventures are actually...
other planet.
Yeah, interplanetary.
But H. Rider Haggard in the 1850s and 60s wrote something he wrote a bunch of novels featuring a character named Alan Quatermain, who was a jungle adventurer. The most famous one is called King Solomon's Mines, where he finds, you guessed it, King Solomon's Mines. And it's got a lot of those jungly kind of tropes, and that turned into Tarzan, which turned into different things. Yeah, so it's interesting that I think it's just George Lucas's weird, oddball sensibilities and genius that he fixated on that. Like, if you were just going to do a pulp story, I think you might actually, at the time, think detective or think superhero. You know, there's other genres besides jungle adventure, and arguably more popular and ones with longer lasting cultural legacy. But they did Indiana Jones. And one thing that's fun to see is that Indiana Jones works. People have tried to do the same kind of things, like tried to draw on those pulp sources pretty explicitly, and it almost always fails. Like in the 90s alone, we had The Rocketeer, we had The Phantom, we had The Shadow. We had like a bunch of direct pulp things. It doesn't usually work. I don't know why, but I mean, you could talk about why each of those individual things fails or didn't quite catch on. But
or we could just talk about Amblin magic.
Yeah, I think Amblin just knew how to do it. And what's smart is I think all those properties, to one degree or another, rely on you to love old pulp magazines and stuff. Indiana Jones, it doesn't matter. He doesn't care.
He does not. He's just not that lazy. He does not care what you bring to it. Yeah. He loves it. And his goal isn't to trust that you love it as much as him. His goal is to make you love it like he loves it.
Yeah, it's what we always complain about J.J. Abrams. He's making a Star Wars movie that draws so much on the assumption that you like Star Wars. And what he should actually be doing is just making a good Star Wars movie. And that's what Spielberg does. He's not making a movie where you have to love pulp adventures or get all the references. He's just making the ultimate pulp adventure. So I guess we should maybe talk real quick about how Indiana Jones fits in everything we've been saying. I mean, he is kind of, I guess you could argue, an insider because he works for
the American government.
The American government, kind of. But it's interesting that they didn't actually make him a real... Like, he could have had the might of American military behind him. James Bond certainly has the might of the British Crown behind him. Indiana Jones exists in a nebulous space at best with the authority figures. They're going to take the Ark away from him and box it up. They don't trust him.
Well, he was intent on that Ark going to the museum, man.
Yeah, he wants it to go to the museum. You don't really know exactly what his relationship is with the museum, besides that his daughter...
Marcus Brody represents the museum that funds his adventures.
Right, and Marcus Brody is kind of cool, I guess, in Raiders. By Crusade, he's just a full-blown... Buffoon.
No, he's cool in Raiders.
Yeah, he's a little bit of the Q or the
exactly
M or whatever of Raiders.
Yeah.
But the fact is, Indiana Jones is going off on himself. He's not being equipped with gadgets. All he's got is his wits and his whip and his gun and his own sense of what's right and wrong.
Yep, and his expertise.
He's got some friends, but at least as it seems to have been originally conceived and as it plays out in the first two movies, he's got different sets of friends, and he's going to have
different places.
And he's, of course, going to have a different woman. It doesn't matter how successful the pairing of Harrison Ford and Karen Allen was. We're not bringing her back because the whole idea is that this guy doesn't get tied down. He's having a different adventure every time. And you can see Temple of Doom really bending over backwards, making itself a prequel, putting the short round character in who's just a completely different type of helper for Indiana Jones, not bringing Sola back. Like, they just want to make it like, well, in one sense, anywhere Indiana Jones goes, he's got friends, but in another sense, he doesn't actually have any friends. Like,
he's on his own.
He's just trying to do what's right, and there's nobody that's really fighting with him. He's not going to bring in the army at the end. Like, a lot of those old Sean Connery, James Bond movies end with the British Army, actually coming in on like jetpacks or something, and they all invade the villain's lair together, and it's yay. Indiana Jones is never going to have anything like that. Although I guess you could argue he kind of does in Temple of Doom, because the colonial guys are up on the cliff shooting down the bad guys. But it's only after Indiana Jones has thoroughly taken care of all the major problems and single-handedly freed the children from being slaves, the child slaves. Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, we're going to talk about how all of these heroes interact with conventional morality. I think it's...
Yeah, but the best way to do all of that is to actually go through the movies in depth. So I think we've provided enough context.
Yeah, that's the context. We'll be back with Raiders of the Lost Ark. I guess the only other thing I'll say is, maybe I didn't touch on enough. If you think about all those guys, Philip Marlowe, Superman, John Wayne, Batman, Rick Blaine, they all have uneasy relationships with conventional morality. It's not just that they're outside the system being good. It's that they are willing to bend or break certain rules, and a man's got to have a code, and they all have their own code. And we, as a watcher of those individual films or reader of those comic books or books, are supposed to usually agree with their code. But we're going to watch how each one of our heroes kind of plays with what's right and what's wrong. It's not a given that they'll all believe in the same things or be for the same things or have the same feelings about who to kill when, which is kind of an important question for an action hero. Jake, any other thoughts about any of this?
I don't think so. I'm ready to get into Raiders.
Yeah, me too. I'm excited about it. And I guess we'll have some more context about Steven Spielberg and George Lucas himself, but we can save that until we get to the actual thing. So we'll be back. Sanity at the Movies, produced by me, executive produced by Jake. Go to patreon.com/Sanity at the Movies. We've got a lot of stuff inside the magical Patreon world of bonus content there. We've got many episodes of us talking about Clone Wars, the animated show, which is its own interesting take on morality and heroism and being inside the system, but also outside the system, but also inside, but maybe ultimately outside. All kinds of cool stuff behind the paywall. So you should go there. Until next time.
I don't believe in surrenders.